I was amazed when I first learned about the mountain huts. Today Kunanyi is a protected park, a delicate natural environment, and the idea of people building whatever and wherever they like is quite disturbing. G'day and welcome to Forgotten Tasmania. I'm John Stevenson. This photo of the Fern retreat hut on Kunanyi, Mt Wellington, taken by Watt Beattie in 1905, was at the peak of the hut building period. What I want to know is how we got to this hut building culture and what went on in the world that led to it. Why did people do this? The photo shows human occupation of Kunanyi, Mt Wellington in about 1905. Archaeological evidence tells us that the Muhanina people were there thousands of years before that. It's estimated that around 10 clans totalling 500 people lived in this area around Greater Hobart, called Nipaluna. George Augustus Robinson wrote the name as Nibbaluna, and another word was used in the Reverend Bedford's papers that were published by Beattie in 1913. There's some debate about the pronunciation of the Muhanina language and what sounds they used. The sound luna seems to relate to place, so the name Nipaluna refers to the country around what is now Greater Hobart. In 1792, William Bligh used the name Table Mountain to describe the 1200 metre backdrop to this picturesque area. In 1798, George Bass climbed Mt Wellington on Christmas Day, and Charles Darwin climbed it later in 1836 as part of his trip around the world. 1804 sees the establishment of Hobart Town at Sullivan's Cove and the beginning of the colonial period. The next 80 years are hard times for everyone. The colony nearly starved to death. There were convicts transported from England to that terrible prison at Port Arthur. There's a brutal war with the indigenous people and the infamous Black Line military operation in 1830. There were criminal gangs called bushrangers terrorising the roads, and we had piracy on the Derwent River. There was a blockade where William Bligh threatened to fire his cannons on Hobart Town. We had cannibalism and many more dark and terrible deeds. In the area of economics, a downturn began in the early 1850s as a result of the gold rush in Victoria. A large number of young men left to make their fortunes, and the exodus was so great that Governor Denison passed land grant regulations as an incentive to stem the flow. Later in the 1860s, there was a major downturn in the economies all along the eastern seaboard. But by the 1880s, things are looking a little better for some people. Convict transportation stopped in 1853. The name of the island changed from Van Diemen's Land to Tasmania in 1856. We've got a cable across Bass Strait for communications with Melbourne, and there's a railway from Hobart to Launceston. Hobart Town has become just Hobart, and we're in the second industrial revolution. Under the Bankers' Law Amendment Acts of 1878 and 1882, there are certain days each year declared as bank holidays. All of these changes to our society meant that Tasmanians had some leisure time. People were starting to get out and explore the Tasmanian wilderness. One of the closest places to explore was Mt Wellington. There were trams up Strickland Avenue and a tea gardens at Cascade. The brewery company had retained the land grants of Hugh McIntosh and Peter de Graves, and they owned most of the land from the summit of the mountain down to Cascades at South Hobart. Maria Grist is the author of several books on the mountain, including one devoted to the huts and hut building culture.
1880s, around that time, Hobart was getting a little bit more settled. The convict days were past, and the place was looking towards federation and things like that. The police were a little bit more organised, and people started to feel safer, so they thought about leisure. And of course, the mountain is right there on the doorstep of Hobart, so where else would they go but up into the mountain? And there are a lot of paths and tracks left by the sawmillers, the loggers from the early days, and these were ones that they used, and they would go up these little trails, find a little secluded spot there next to a stream, and off they would go and start building.
Ordinary citizens could buy the right to build a holiday cottage on the mountain.
And they would pay a peppercorn rent, and then the Cascade Ranger would come around once a week and pick up a little bit of money from the hut owners. Yeah.
Okay, so it was some degree of regulation, not...
Yes, probably more to save Cascade from having a problem with ownership of the land.
At first they were rudimentary affairs, quite simple shacks. The first in 1888 didn't even have a name. But then in 1890, Grass Tree Hut was built. It was really ornate and it started a trend.
Yes, well, the first huts, people just go up and build any old thing out of slabs of bark or tree trunks. And they were fairly simple. But then there was the Grass Tree Hut, which was occupied by several people who had an interest in natural things, and they liked the flowing lines of the arts and crafts movement, so they just started to make everything a little bit more ornate, and they put in these trellises and plant pots and verandas and things, and that became very, very famous, and soon everybody wanted to get in on the act and make their little hut more beautiful than everyone else's.
There began a culture of building not only functional huts, but pretty little holiday homes. Some had fireplaces, furniture, telephones and tennis courts. They were a retreat from work where Tasmanians could relax and entertain. The first Fern retreat hut was built in 1890. The huts were a sort of club affair, and the people that built huts were called members. Some members of Fern Retreat were Arge, Jones, Ryland and Cowles.
1890s was the first version, and again it was a simple hut with a hip roof. But even then they started off putting a little bit of ornamentation just underneath the eaves and a little finial on the top. And after a few years, in 1905, that actually a big tree fell down on it and squished it flat. So this happened to several of the huts. One or other mishap happened to some, got burnt out, but they were always rebuilt at this time, around 1905-ish. And so this hut was rebuilt, a completely different design. Now it had a hip roof, and it became very famous. It was featured on a lot of postcards of the day, and all the ladies would come in their fine dresses and have a cup of tea and have dinner and play tennis, all those sorts of things.
The first version of the hut had the chimney at the back. Later a veranda and summer house were added, somewhere between July and December 1903. In 1904, a tree fell and crushed the hut. The second version, shown in the Beattie photo, was built somewhere between 1904 and 1905. The summer house also had an upgrade, and large verandas were added to both buildings. There was a telephone strung between Fern Retreat and Bluebell Hut, to warn of the approach of walkers so they could put the billy on.
They were happy to provide dinner as well as tea, and you walk from one to another, and there was apparently a bit of a line between a couple of the huts, so one of them would ring to say, oh, there's people coming your way, so they'd phone through to the other one. Yeah, so people the huts got very famous, and people would come from interstate and occasionally even overseas to visit them because they were so famous.
Hospitality was the name of the game. Guests were welcome, and they were never short of entertainment. There was a rope swing and a tennis court. One of the other huts even had a piano.
Yeah, well, the tennis court, I don't believe, was up to specs. It was, well, on looking at the site now, there's a large flat area in front of where the chimney was and the hut itself was, and I believe that's where it was. Probably successive floods and successive track building has kind of altered the route a little bit. There was also supposed to be a swing there, and there was a little bridge across, and you can still see the little foundations of the bridge in the creek today, and a little summer house off to the left, which also had various different incarnations as they added to it.
There were many letters to the newspaper praising the food, company and good times to be had in the mountain huts. My quest to rephotograph Fern Retreat will be really interesting.
Basically, when the First World War arrived, all the young men had to go off to war, all the fit young men, and basically the whole country's worry about the war and their need to contribute towards the war took their attention away from these kinds of pursuits. So although there were a couple of huts left after the First World War, they were never added to or built, and they were never rebuilt once they finally went. So around 1920, we estimate, is when the last huts disappeared.
Over 100 years of rainforest activity and a few bushfires have hidden the remains, but Maria tells me there are still stones and artefacts from the Fern Retreat hut. She's kindly offered to show me the site and explain a little more once we get there. It's quite a solid bushwalk, but I'm up for it, even if I am carrying too much camera gear. I'm joined on our walk by my old flatmate and filmmaker Brian Dimmick. He shot a documentary about the mountain some time ago. Brian's almost finished his feature film Macbeth 1040 AD. Maria is accompanied by her husband John. Together they've been exploring the mountain and researching the huts for many years. The original track to Fern Retreat was closed long ago and it's been lost to the forest. Our walk in is pretty tricky, and I would never have found the site without a guide. Once you step off the track, you risk doing damage to the natural environment, so we're extra careful.
Here we've got the remains of the Fern Retreat hut chimney. Quite substantial and a little bit tumble down, as you can see, covered with moss. There's only the one chimney base here at the moment, but there were in fact two versions of the hut. There was one little kind of just a single room bark hut, and actually what happened was a big tree fell on it one day and the whole thing was demolished. And because there's only the one chimney base here, we imagine that the chimney base would have stayed and they would have rebuilt it when they built the second version of the hut, which was much more ornate.
And then what's this flat area around this
Well,
one?
the flat area at the front, they almost all had a recreation area, and this particular one was used for playing tennis, which is kind of a nice thing. Apparently they had a swing here as well, which they had probably high up there somewhere off a tree, and people would swing out over this huge gap, which was exciting for everyone. The second version of the hut is the one that's in the Beattie photograph, which you have in your collection, I should say.
All good. And where do you think he was when he took that photo? You think he's
On the other side of the creek, and probably up a little bit. It's going to be very tricky trying to photograph from there because of the amount of vegetation in the way. So here we have some stone walling, which would have been towards the back of the hut. And out this way, a little bit hard to see because of all the plants, but it's reasonably extensive. The flat recreation area, a lot of ferns. They loved their tree ferns in those days. They really did. They valued them very much. It's lovely if you just stumble across some of these ruins and try and imagine what people were doing here 100 years ago, over 100 years ago. Well, we're just a few steps away from where we were a minute ago with the chimney base. And what we have over here, which is quite difficult to see, is a stone support there, which used to be where the bridge came across between the summer house and the hut. The bridge was again built in the ornate style with little fancy bent bits of wood and that carefully put up. Just like everything else was, it was part of the whole picture. I believe it was put up at still with the first version of the hut, so quite a long time ago. And the bridge and the hut and everything else was no longer there after about 1920. So we have the last record of somebody coming to visit around that time. We don't actually know what happened to it, but all of these huts would have either rotted or burnt because there were a number of fires in the area.
So the fires, you think, would have been a consequence of, the human occupation of the mountain, or do you think they were a natural?
A lot of them were natural, a lot of them were human caused. We know of one particular fire which was caused by the overseer and the gang that was building their road up to the springs, and that got away and it burned Henry Dobson's chalet, which caused quite a kerfuffle at the time, and he ended up suing.
There were sawmills and, there was quite a lot of activity, industrial activity.
Yes, prior to the huts.
Prior to the huts, yeah.
Yes, there was wood gathering after that, but the sawmilling industry was at its heyday before the huts were built. In fact, the hut builders used a lot of the original sawmill tracks to access the nice spots that they chose.
And that was one of the things they prided themselves in, using local materials.
Yes, yes, they would prefer always to build something rather than buy it and bring it in. Everything was made by hand, the seating, the furniture, There's even a record of one person who made a complete tea set out of coconut shells. So we think just over there's a very small flat area. We think that's where the summer house was, and then behind that is a track, which would have been part of the original access, I think.
I have to try and recreate the Beattie photo. That's what's next. And yeah, it sounds like it's going to be challenging, but I'm up for it. Well, I'm going to have to get over there on the other side of the valley, and the vegetation is pretty thick there. And yeah, get up that fairly steep slope and try and find the spot. And then I'll use the Then and Now app to overlay the two photos and hopefully find the rough spot. Given that we've got a good landmark with the chimney, so if I get that, use that as my guide and line up on that, hopefully I'll be able to find the spot.
I'm having difficulty orienting myself, and I struggle to see where Mr. Beattie would have taken his picture from. My plan was to use the stone chimney as a waypoint, but the bush is so thick I can't see the chimney at all once I get more than a couple of metres back from it. John suggests we cross the creek where the bridge would have been and take a look from the other side. From over there I can see the remains of the stonework that supported the bridge. All of a sudden I have a new waypoint. As I back up the valley, getting a wider and wider shot, it starts to line up. When it's looking pretty close on the iPhone, I stumble over some stones, and Maria's excited as these are the edges of the original track we thought was lost. She notices a glint on the ground and carefully uncovers a glass fragment, probably from a 1905 bottle. We leave it where it is and take a photo before covering it up the way it was. One of the many threats to these huts is souvenir hunters. Interfering with or removal of any historic object from the mountain park is strictly against the law. I assume Mr. Beattie would have been on this path. This is a good place to take a photo from, so I think I found the exact spot 115 years later.
So once I've found the exact spot and I get my recreation, then I do a series of still photos with the iPhone, and I pan across the area. So basically give me maybe a 180 degree view right around, and a sequence of photos, and so I went right round from there, right round to where you are, and then I can stitch those together in Photoshop.
Yes.
And then zoom in on the bit that I want. So it should give us two pretty good recreations of the
fantastic
the Beattie photo. Yeah.
True to our values, we take nothing but photos and leave only footprints, albeit carefully placed footprints from our well-washed walking shoes. The mountain's a beautiful place, and I was so happy to be back, if only for a short visit. That's the great thing about Hobart. When you've had enough of the city, there's wilderness only 15 minutes away. The story of the hut builders is the story of a generation of Tasmanians discovering this experience for themselves. We are Tasmanian. These are our stories. This is Forgotten Tasmania.